what's up and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello! My name is Erica and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about all things Carthage context. Now, before we can get into that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you've so kindly done that, let's get into the video. Before diving into ancient Carthage, I just wanted to tell you guys why I'm doing this episode, how you guys can use this episode, and the reason is because after this I will be going into a series of videos that are just a general overview of the Punic Wars. This is something that you guys have been asking me for a while, and normally I do really detailed summaries of ancient texts, and I just thought that since this was so popular and so highly requested, I would give you guys a nice general overview of what happened in the wars before, as we continue with this channel, we start going into the Livy, the Polybius, and all of that, so that you know where each piece of information comes from, how it changes throughout different sources, etc., etc. So this episode is not going to be about the Punic Wars, it's just about Carthage, because I think trying to piece together what this incredible place was like in the ancient world is such a vital part of really appreciating what happened. Not only appreciating, but also understanding the tragedy of what happened during the Punic Wars and understanding who Rome was up against. So you guys know I love a context episode, and that is what this is today. It is supposed to be used in conjunction to the Punic Wars, but I guess also you can be watching this outside of that understanding as well, just to kind of gain a bit of understanding of where Carthage was, what it was doing, what it was famous for, and what was going on prior to the First Punic War. So that was a long intro, but let's get into the founding dates, what was going on there, and how Carthage itself was established. The traditional date of Carthage is the 9th century BCE, and the specific date that historians normally go with is around 814 BCE, right? So all of my nerds who have been watching this channel for a while, you guys will have hopefully seen my Homer series. So this is prior to Homer writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, because that's around 750-ish BCE. So just to kind of contextualize that for you, Carthage is popping up before Homer's doing his thing. And as you will find out throughout this series, Carthage falls in the 2nd century BCE to Rome. Carthage was established on the northern tip of Africa because the Phoenicians, who are the ancient peoples that ended up moving into this plot of land in North Africa, they were looking to place themselves in ideal trading spots around the Mediterranean. Now, this specific plot of land in North Africa was the optimal point for not only north-south trading, but also east and west trading, right? So this plot of land gave them so much access to the Mediterranean, so much access to all of the areas around there. Obviously, as we'll see throughout this video, the Carthaginians do a fantastic job of establishing trading and merchant ports among all of these different plot of lands. But really, when it comes to this northern tip of Africa, they picked it so specifically because it was an incredible access point for them. And now this is a slightly minor point, but I do think it's just as important, is that the port area in where Carthage was established, I meant where Carthage was established, this northern sort of point was also optimal for building incredible port structures. Now, not all landscapes allow for this. Obviously, if you go to any coastline, not all of them are like, oh yeah, we can build a really nice bay here. But this plot was, and in the ancient world, that is really how you established yourselves, how you showed off wealth, how you showed off grandeur. Like, just think of all of these incredible structures from the ancient world that still stand today. The Acropolis in Athens, the Colosseum in Rome. You know, all of these things were there because that was what those places were doing, was sort of establishing when you walk close enough and you can see this big thing, or sail close enough in the case of the Acropolis, as well as Carthage, what would have been their incredibly famous trading port. You know, that was really showing people who were, you know, stumbling upon this, where they were and what types of people were there. So this bay, this port in North Africa, was a great spot to build on as well. Again, not as important of a point, but still, I think, quite an important thing to mention. As a result of this new position that Carthage ended up founding itself on, the budding new economy, all of those sorts of things, the city grows incredibly quickly according to the ancient sources. we hear that within a century of its founding, Carthage actually grows to around 40,000 people. That is incredibly fast growth. In fact, in a number of these sources, we do hear that the city expands so quickly that the walls of the city were continuously knocked down and rebuilt to accommodate its growing population. Now, before we continue with the founding story and establishment of Carthage, going into the economic structure, political structure, all of that kind of stuff, I think it's important for me, because I keep saying the sources that we have. What are those sources, right? It's important that we kind of get on the same playing field here and understand exactly what we're dealing with, because the sources of Carthage are incredibly difficult. Reason being is because nothing from Carthage survives. As I said, Carthage falls in the 2nd century BC to Rome during these Punic Wars, as we will see throughout this series. However, Rome wants to obliterate Carthage. It wants to just completely get rid of them as a peoples and as a city. So we have minimal archaeology that survives. I mean, like literally a couple of rocks that survive in Carthage today. And when it comes to the written work, we have nothing, absolutely nothing written by the Carthaginians survives. So everything that we hear comes from the Romans and the Greeks. These authors include Livy, Polybius, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Herodotus, Aristotle, and Fabius Pictor, just to name a few. And Timaeus actually says a really funny side note. This doesn't fit into the narrative of the episode whatsoever, but I want to include it. Timaeus tells us that the Carthaginians, he thinks that they're really weird because they wear underwear. There's a really fun fact that, again, has nothing to... Anyways, fun. All of those, obviously, in the case of Herodotus, they're not telling us about the Punic Wars, they're just telling us about Carthage itself. In fact, this plot of land is also referenced in the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, and also then Tyre. I'll get on to how this links to Tyre in just one moment. That is also mentioned in the book of Kings. So... why am I mentioning this? Because everything that we hear about Carthage is not only from the outside looking in, but also from people that do not like the Carthaginians at all. So the Romans, as we will discover, really did not like the Carthaginians, and the Greeks really didn't either. Now, this means that as historians, when we're going through these sources to reconstruct an idea of Carthage, there is a lot of work that has to get done. Mainly, and the thing that I want to share with you guys, is as you go through the Latin and the Greek sometimes, but mainly the Latin sources, there is so much double meaning in the words that are used to describe Carthage, the plot of land, the city, the people. All of that is really seeped in this heavy language. And the language really evokes this image of Carthage almost being like dark and glamorous. Can you say those two things at the same time? I guess so. It's sort of like something that's alluring that shouldn't be alluring, but that is. And that is how Carthage is really tackled in the Latin sources. So as historians, we have to look at that language. I say it as if I have personally done it. I mean, like, I have read these sources, but I'm not the person that has, like, translated it and had to do all that. That's, like, the real historians. I'm just here to tell you what the discipline entails, which is unpacking the language and trying to do it in the most appropriate way possible, right? So it's our job as historians to take out that sort of side of it when we're discussing Carthage as a place in order to give you guys a history of it. So just bear that in mind as we continue. However, let's talk about the legendary founding story of Carthage. According to legend, Carthage was called, and I'm going to butcher this, but it's Carthage, I think is how you pronounce it. It's up on the screen in its spelling. But either way, that is what it is called by the legendary founder called Dido. Now, if you guys have been with the channel for a while, then you will know that we have done an Aeneid series here. And in book 4 in particular is really where this character Dido is sort of there to shine, right? That is her moment. She is the queen of Carthage. She appears in book 1, but she really sort of has her big heart-wrenching moment in book 4. We all cried. It was a big deal. And Virgil's version of Dido is different to the legendary founding story, however, not necessarily all that far off. As what happens with legendary founding stories, if you can think of like Romulus and Remus, that changes over the centuries. It just tells us a little bit about, you know, who's telling the story, what their values were, what the audience's values were, especially as that changes, how times change and how values change, right? So just bear that in mind when we look at like legendary stories. But to Dido, because Dido is who we're talking about, Dido comes from the city of Tyre, and she is married to a man called Acabas, which is different than the Aeneid because his name is Sychaeus in the Aeneid, but still she has a husband. That's the most important point. Dido's brother is called Pygmalion, and he is the king of Tyre. Now, he becomes incredibly jealous of his brother-in-law because Acabas is unbelievably wealthy. Pygmalion's jealousy grew so much that he decided to have Acabas murdered because the overall plan, bear in mind this is a patriarchal society, is that if he murders his sister's husband, then he will acquire the wealth that the husband had, right? Because again, women had to go into the care of a man. The man who would have taken care of Dido would be her brother, and so therefore her and all of her assets, which would have been her husband's money, would have gone with her. So this plan, in an ancient sense, makes sense. I don't know if I explained that very well, but if I didn't, let me know in the comments. Regardless, Pygmalion decides to have Acabas murdered, thinking that he can acquire this wealth. However, Dido is like 10 steps ahead of everybody. So she notices that her brother has her husband murdered, and she decides to act in a way that would have been seen as incredibly pious. What she does is, as soon as this murder happens, she puts all of his wealth into these bags and throws them into the sea off the coast of Tyre. Now, this would have been done as more so an offering to the gods, incredibly respectful. No one can really say anything to her about this. So basically her brother did not move in fast enough and he is annoyed, but he can't get mad publicly at her because she's technically done what she's supposed to do. On the surface, because Dido hasn't actually done this. What Dido's done is she has filled these bags with materials that look like wealth, tied the bags up, thrown them into the sea, taken the actual wealth, put that on a boat, and disappeared into the sunset. Right? She has sailed off. She wants to escape her past life, escape what's happened with her brother, escape her now dead husband. She's now a widow, and she ends up in North Africa. And like I said, she establishes the city of Carthage, which is called Carthage. However it is that you pronounce it. So that's the founding legend. But when we start going into Carthage throughout history and how it's structured, the political, economic, all of that, things get a little bit tricky, as I've explained as to why. One thing that isn't tricky to figure out is the religion on the plus side. So we know that the Carthaginians were, like many ancient societies, polytheistic. We actually have a number of their gods that have been named in sources, including Baal Hamon, I think is how you pronounce it, which is the weather god who was considered responsible for the fertility of vegetation, esteemed as sort of the king of the gods and all of that. Another god called Melkart and Tamit. And we know, much like any other ancient society, that all of these gods had individual temples and were honored in specific ways. Though we don't have many more specifics about the religion, that is a really nice piece of the puzzle that we can slot in to the Carthaginians and to their society. Now, with the economic structure, let's dive into this because this is where things start heating up. Carthage's economy over its history is really based in trade, right? So they are incredible merchants and incredible traders, therefore meaning that they were unbelievable seafarers. So they really understood how to read the sea, look at the waves and determine when they should sail, when they shouldn't sail, look at the weather, all of those sorts of things because they were traders. Now, from the sources that we have on offer from Carthage, it really doesn't seem like they had an imperialist bone in their body. All they were concerned about was establishing ports in as many places as possible so that they could trade with as many peoples and make the most money to bring back to Carthage, which was incredibly wealthy. Carthage starts off with trading raw materials, but over time it does understand and get sort of a backing of how to do agriculture as well, which really changes the game. Because in the beginning, when Carthage was first established, supposedly they had to rely on imports of food and all of that before they hacked how to actually farm and do all of that. And then when they did, they were like the best farmers. Like, they ended up just being phenomenal at it. In fact, here's a fun fact. The only thing that the Romans decided to keep and not destroy when they were destroying everything in Carthage was this, like, 28 volume, I'm not even joking, 28 volume like encyclopedia on agriculture. They were like, everything else is burnt aside from that, because they really knew what they were doing there, and we could use some of that knowledge. And when they also did this agricultural thing, they really understood fishing. So it's around the 6th century BCE, they really got a handle of fishing and all of that. And they really made their exports an incredible part of their wealth, an incredible part of their economy. That was what they were known for. Like I said, they were not marching around with their army trying to overtake people. That's not part of their history. They were trying to put their hands into everybody's pockets though. And you know what? I can respect that. Now, in saying that, a really interesting part of Carthage's history is actually that we know that between Carthage and Rome, there were 2 initial sort of business treaties. Can you call them business treaties? There were like these contracts that were actually drawn up between the Carthaginians and the Romans, specifically sort of up in Etruria. The Carthaginians established a port there, trading port there. And we have these 2, like I said, treaties, contracts, whatever it is that we're going to call them, throughout various points of Roman history. One is established in 509 BCE and one is 348 BCE, which basically says that the Carthaginians are allowed to be there, they are allowed to trade in this spot, they are allowed to engage in business there. The Romans give them full permission. And the first treaty is actually really interesting. So that's the one treaty. Again, that's a really wrong word. We're going to say contract. That's probably a better word. Like a business contract. The first one is really interesting because it's dated to 509. Now we get this in Polybius. He tells us about this. And the reason why this date is so important to us is because that is when Rome is changing from being a monarchy, it's changing from being a kingdom into being the republic. So a lot of these contracts, right, when it comes to trades, when it comes to business, they were all being re-established during this time under the new Roman political structure. So the fact that Carthage is thrown in there, they said, yeah, you know, sure, you can keep doing your thing on your port, which, by the way, they called that port Punicum, because that's how many, right, this is important, that is how many Carthaginians were there in this plot of land. They had so many of them that was basically called Little Carthage. That's what Punicum is. Oh, and also the word Punic is actually the Roman word for Phoenician, because they all came from Tyre, which is in Phoenicia, so they were all Phoenician by blood and by descendants and all of that. So that's the first contract that we see in the history books, and then there's a second one in 348, which re-establishes the Carthaginian and Roman trade system, and actually ends up being a little bit more favourable to Carthage, that they could get a little bit more money back for it, they have a little bit more benefits. But it shows us that actually throughout Carthage's history, they are merchants, as we know, but they have a good trading relationship with the Romans, which is fascinating considering how this all ends, which we will get to in the coming weeks. So now that we've understood the founding story, the dates of Carthage, a general sort of history, and the economic structure of it, including a little bit of what we know of the religion, why don't we start tapping into the political and military side of things? Because that is really vital to understand this dynamic in order to really get what goes on in the Punic Wars in a different light. I find a lot of people don't know and don't understand the military and political position when it comes to Carthage, because this is utterly fascinating in my opinion, especially when we're looking at the political structure, because it changes quite a bit. And the political structure of Carthage, from what we can see, is written by a bunch of historians that are highly confused as to how it works. Aristotle, when he mentions Carthage, he really likes the constitution of Carthage. He really likes how it's run, but even he can't really explain to us what it is. In fact, he tells us it's a combination of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. It's some sort of middle ground that he's like, I'm not really sure, but it exists in that kind of a way. And so he likes it, is his conclusion. He's like, yeah, it's a bit of a mix, a bit eclectic. Might as well have some interest in that. When Carthage is originally established by those coming from Tyre to North Africa, originally it is a monarchy, supposedly, okay? So it's run by kings, and then the kings at some point are abolished, and a new system is brought into Carthage. Now, this should sound a lot like Rome, just that everybody knows. So the system that is established, it's not called a republic when we're looking at the sources. However, at the top of the Carthaginian political system are these 2 annually elected magistrates. Hello. But they are called suffets, not consuls. I think you say it suffets. Suffetes. Yes, that's how you spell it. Safets, I think is how you say it. But those are the two top elected magistrates who run Carthage for a year, right? So that's what they do for the year. Below them are sort of the right-hand men to them, because there would be multiple of them. And then beneath them would be the Senate body, which would be about 200, 300 members. And then beneath that would be the public assembly. That sounds an awful like Rome. So if you understand the political structure of Rome, you'll get the political structure of Carthage. However, a very, very important note for me to put in here is that the main difference is that when we look at the Roman political system, a lot of that is directly tied to military service. I say this all the time when discussing different people on the channel, different Roman people on the channel. You really have to prove yourself in military, and your dedication to Rome and all of that kind of stuff is integral to how you rise in the ranks politically. This doesn't exist in Carthage. Okay, so from what we can see, the Carthaginian political system is entirely separate to the military system of Carthage. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. One of the main ones that historians put forward is that it is unbelievably hard to acquire Carthaginian citizenship, and therefore they do not have members of high-ranking society as part of the military, but also they tend to not have full citizens in the military either, which begs the question, how in the world do you have an army? How do you structure yourselves military speaking if you don't want your high members of society in the military and you don't want your legal full citizens on the front lines of battle? Unlike Rome, Carthage decides to go in two major directions when it comes to building their military fronts, shall we say? When dealing with their army, they go in two main directions. The first one is allied troops, allied armies, and the second one is mercenaries. Now, these have pros and cons to them, in particular against Rome, because Rome at this period are just get everybody fighting. The Romans end up being quite clumsy with this because they're training ordinary men to be soldiers and just throwing them out onto the battlefield. I mean, at one point there are something like 700,000 Romans during the Punic Wars. There are crazy numbers because they just got everyone to serve, which meant they weren't always tight as an army. And the way that Carthage goes about this by having allied soldiers and mercenaries allows them to have an army that is ready at all times, has trained together, lived together, understands the assignment. They are soldiers through and through. They're not citizens, having to be trained to be soldiers. They just are soldiers. However, this is a problem because they're not citizens, right? So they're not actually fighting for the Carthaginian cause. In the case of allied armies, what does this mean? This means, anybody that Carthage sort of had an allyship with, they would then go to and they would say, this is part of the treaty, this is part of the deal, you'll fight for us. And they say, cool, that sounds great, we're more than happy to do that. So they have all of their armies and they are willing to lend them, essentially, give them to Carthage for whatever cause it is. So they are tied by a deal, for lack of a better phrase. The mercenaries, if you don't know what a mercenary is, it is somebody who is paid to fight, right? So a soldier whose job it is to be a soldier, which means that they are not, under any circumstances, attached to your cause. They are attached to the monetary gain from this. This is a very important point because in between the First and Second Punic Wars, we have a mercenary war because no one's getting paid. So this is, even though it sounds like a good idea because you have soldiers and you have people who are part of the army that know what they're doing, that are really good within their troops, that can get onto the battlefield and do whatever it is that they have to do, and they can do it at the drop of a hat. I mean, they are ready to go whenever you call on them. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. Now, the Carthaginians, as I've mentioned, they are incredible seafarers, so that is a big part of their military as well. So they are very, very good on their boats. Like I said, they can watch the waves and all of this. This is how they are going to fight as well. Okay, so this is a major part of their attack, is seafaring. Now, the key to all of this is finding then a general who can do all of these things. And when we look at the Punic Wars, I'm obviously going to mention the most famous Hannibal in the Second Punic War, such an incredible general. He is an anomaly. And the reason why he's an anomaly is not because he's an incredibly gifted general and he knows how to band together these different types of armies and make them work together, even though they would have never met before, but because they are all these tight units, He not only understood how to make them work to the best ability that they could, but he was also just a great general that had a very long-standing post as a full-bodied citizen. So Hannibal is really, really special when it comes to that, because a general's job is to be able to do all of these things, and Hannibal can, which is so different and so special, and why the Second Punic War is very dire at times for the Romans, because they the Carthaginians happen to stumble upon somebody that understands military, that understands how to make people work together, that understands the seas, and then understands battle, as well as really loving Carthage itself. Now, in saying that, there are some members of the citizen body of Carthage that do serve in the military, but if they are only very high up senior executives, right? So we do, as we work through these episodes, we will see a number of them. Unfortunately, they kind of all have the same name. This is something you're gonna have to get used to, is that you think Rome's bad for everybody having the same name. Carthage is worse, okay? There are, like, everybody is called Hanno, Hannibal, Hamilcar, Mago. Like, those are the names, okay? And we have to figure out by putting numbers on the end of it, or being like, not that Hannibal, this Hannibal, not that Hamilcar. Goodness gracious, there are so many Hamilcars. This is something that you will have to get used to. But again, we do see even a number of senior officers, senior executives that are full Carthaginian citizens, but they are only incredibly high up if they decide to take part at all. So, in saying all of that, there are a couple of things about the ancient military, ancient warfare, that I should probably prep you guys for in order to kind of segue us into the First Punic War. And the first thing, and one of the most important things that you guys should know and walk away from, is that a general tactic when it comes to ancient warfare is that you do not want to attack first. Okay, whenever you go into the ancient sources, what they will try and do time and time again, it doesn't matter who's fighting with who, they are trying to instigate the other person to attack. Now, why do they do this? Well, obviously warfare in any circumstance throughout any time period is incredibly, incredibly risky. It is obviously incredibly dangerous. You don't want to do it, right? Like, nobody wants to do it. However, in particular, nobody wants to be the first one to attack, because if you attack first, you've got to be very confident that you can win. And obviously when it comes to a number of ancient warfare, they had like no idea. They had no idea if they could win this thing. And in fact, when it comes to the Second Punic War in particular, we'll see a lot of the tactics that the Romans use is just not to attack Hannibal. Okay, so you do not want to be attacking first unless you are 1000% sure. Your job really is, if you want to engage in war, the Romans really wanted to engage in war, you are going to instigate the other side and you are going to push them to a point where they feel like there is nothing else possible aside from war, because then that way you could also claim, victimhood, which the Romans did. Now, the other thing which is vital is that when it comes to travel in the ancient world, I've been talking a lot about seafaring. This is what as I keep saying, the Carthaginians are very, very famous for. Now, when it comes to seafaring, in an ancient boat, one of those could only go for about 3 days without touching land. This is why, when it comes to the ancient Mediterranean, all of those islands are hot commodities, okay? These are like prime real estate. Everybody wants to either have the whole island or establish it as one of their ports. So the Carthaginians are very aware of this, right? So that's why they have so many ports all over the Mediterranean, so they don't have to keep, going, okay, well, if we're just trying to, then we'll have to, nope, they have ports absolutely everywhere. Trade is very, very easy for them. So when it comes to ancient battles, something that is vital for you guys to understand is that when the Carthaginians especially, and I keep referencing the Second Punic War because that's what everybody knows the most, and that's just easier for me to do. When it comes to this ancient warfare and ancient battle, you don't have these incredible, sea battles out in the middle of nowhere because you can't. And also when it comes to Hannibal, for example, when he's in Spain, and, one of the most impressive things that he does in the Second Punic War, which is why everybody talks about him, is that he marches up and over into Italy, right? I'm doing the map this way, and you guys, I don't know why I'm doing that, but anyways, he goes up and over, right, over the Alps, and there's always, I see on forums online of people being like, why wouldn't he just sail across? He couldn't. Sardinia's in the way. There is no port at this point because the Romans have been very, very cheeky and have taken Sardinia, and so therefore there is no place for them to stop. So literally the journey is too long, right? So as we go through this, if at any point you're like, why didn't they just sail? They couldn't, because the boats could only be out there for 3 days, maximum. So gearing up for the First Punic War, this all takes place on Sicily. And Sicily is another place in the Mediterranean that is an unbelievable hot commodity. Sardinia is, anywhere on the coast is the place to be, a place to be. But Sicily in particular, this is smack bang in the middle of these international, at this point, trading routes, right? So this is a very important island. And Carthage has established many, many ports all over Sicily. In the 730s BCE, Syracuse is established by the Greeks in Sicily. And this is really where there's not like outright conflict, but there is hostility certainly between the Carthaginians and the Greeks comes from. Because when the Greeks come in, they don't just stop with Syracuse, they start pushing the Carthaginians further and further and further. So by the time of the First Punic War, the western half of Sicily is really all Carthaginian, and the eastern part of Sicily is mostly Greek. Now, like I said, there is this bonding between the Romans and the Carthaginians. So the Carthaginians are certainly shocked by the way that the First Punic War happens. Some would also agree that the Romans, it's a very accidental first war that happens between the two of them because they have this already established friendship where they seem to also commonly hate the Greeks, which I think is very vital for everybody to understand that it seems like they should really team up against the Greeks that are on the eastern side with Syracuse because Syracuse is a big part of this whole kerfuffle and all of this on Sicily. And so when we stumble into the First Punic War, it all takes place on and around Sicily. Okay, so this is really where things come in because it should have really been a showdown between the Carthaginians and the Greeks, and it ends up being a showdown between the Romans and the Carthaginians themselves. And that is where I will leave you because I will explain more context about the First Punic War in that episode to help you guys kind of contextualize that a little bit before we get into the general storyline of what happens that engages Rome and turns Rome and Carthage into enemies. That does not stop, as it should, at the end of the First Punic War, but continues for 2 more wars afterwards. So, I hope you guys enjoyed, and with that I will love you and leave you because next week we will be getting into the First Punic War. Do not forget to check out the description below where you can find a lot of the sources that we use, all of the sources. If I can find all of them for free, they will be linked in the description below. I'll link whatever it is for free so you guys can read the sources, look at the ancient languages and all of that fun stuff down in the description. Please do not be shy to check that out. But thank you guys so much, and I'll be seeing you next time with the First Punic War on MoAn Inc. I'll see you guys then.